This will be the last of our series on the St. Clair Tunnel, and as in our last video, we'll continue taking some excerpts from Port Huron historian T.J. Gaffney. Mr. Gaffney says this: power itself is delivered via an overhead catenary system hung from giant steel towers roughly 250 feet apart and measuring 24 feet high in the yards and approaches. In the tunnel itself, the copper wire was suspended by steel brackets mounted directly into the cast iron tunnel liner, which was hung only a few inches from the top of the tunnel. There were obvious concerns of running bare wire along a cast iron lining in a perpetually damp tunnel, but unbelievably, this caused no major issues throughout the tunnel's operation. The process took roughly 2 years to complete and several thousand man-hours worth of labor. This gives you a pretty good idea of the connections between the locomotive and the wires, and also a good look at the towers that supported them. The use of electric locomotives had greatly improved the lives of train crews. If they broke down for some reason in the tunnel, they could get outside the engine without fear of being asphyxiated, and their nearly flawless operation endeared them to the crews. The reality was, however, by the late 1950s, a newer technology had come forth to challenge the electrics and their supremacy: diesel power. The use of diesel locomotives in the St. Clair Tunnel was probably inevitable at some point. The electric's reliability had given them some reprieve. Railroads in North America began converting from steam to diesel power in the 1930s. World War II and its ban on construction of diesels for non-military use slowed the process. By the late 1950s, most American railroads were completely dieselized. Canadian railroads lagged behind a bit, but they too had completed the transition from steam to diesel by the early 1960s. Unlike the electrical locomotives, the diesel did not need to take power from an outside source of an overhead wire, allowing it to travel anywhere on the railroad. Thus, trains could be hauled in by diesel, inspected by customs, and moved through the tunnel without having to switch out power. In short, the specialized nature of the electrics, once a huge improvement, were now leading to their downfall. The flexibility of the diesel locomotives allowed the railway to send any train through the tunnel with any power available. Also, the ability to operate diesels of varying horsepowers via a single locomotive in multiple units allowed the railroad to match the power to the size of the train needed. One obvious negative was the fact that diesel locomotives, while not as smoky as steam locomotives, still had an exhaust, which could cause problems for crews in the tunnel. As such, to remove the diesel's exhaust, Canadian National renovated the ventilation system for the tunnel, which hadn't been needed since the 1908 elimination of steam. New ducts were installed along each side of the tunnel, with blowers located at each portal to suck out the fumes. This did the job, and on September 28, 1958, the electrics were officially replaced by diesel power for the operations of trains through the tunnel. If you were paying attention, you notice I said Canadian National in this last segment. Grand Trunk, in order to compete with the Canadian Pacific and Canadian Northern Railway, joined the transcontinental adventure by creating the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway Company. This would spell financial disaster for the company, which was dragged into bankruptcy in 1919. The federal government took charge of the railway and in 1923 amalgamated it with the Canadian National Railways, which later became Canadian National. Of course, this is a more familiar logo we see now, CNN. By the late 1940s, Canadian National had lowered the floor of the tunnel to allow for larger modern freight cars to pass through it. By the late 1960s, however, the height of the tri-level automobile carriers and 85-foot boxcars made them too high to be used in the tunnel. These cars were then sent to Detroit, Windsor, to be moved via CNN's ferry service there. This created a very inconvenient situation for auto plants in Michigan, particularly in the Flint area, as they had to send their parts from Canada to the U.S. in a much more circuitous route. The answer was to go back to history, and consequently a new car ferry service was inaugurated between Port Huron and Sarnia. Beginning in 1969, Grand Trunk and Canadian National began building new car float aprons on either side of the St. Clair River to accommodate this operation. The railcar ferry of the St. Clair was purchased from the neighboring Chesapeake and Ohio, which since 1953 had a similar operation in place between Port Huron and Sarnia. It was definitely ironic that the original car ferry operation, which had been replaced by the tunnel 80 years prior to this, should not be downgraded by this new version of a car ferry operation. The reality was, however, that this was not a replacement but an augment to the tunnel. There are a couple little tidbits I'd like to share with you about the tunnel and the Grand Trunk Railway before we close out this series. In this photograph here you can see Charles Melville Hayes standing beside one of the new electric automotives, and he was president of the Grand Trunk Railway. In April of 1912, Hayes was in London soliciting financial support for the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. He was anxious to get back to Canada, and Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, which owned the Titanic, invited him to join him on the Titanic. Perhaps to discuss business, I really don't know. But Hayes and his wife Clara, his daughter Orion, his son-in-law Thornton, his secretary, and a maid shared a deluxe suite on a promenade deck. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14, Titanic struck an iceberg. Hayes helped the women in his party into one of the ship's 20 lifeboats, but he, his son-in-law, and his male secretary remained and perished when the ship sank. Hayes was reported to have made a prophetic remark on the evening of the disaster, deploring the way the steamship lines were competing to win passengers with ever faster vessels. He is said to have commented, "The time will come soon when the trend will be checked by some appalling disaster." Hayes' body was recovered from the waters of the North Atlantic and was buried at Mount Royal Cemetery in Montreal. The other two incidents I'd like to share with you happened during wartime. The first one happened in early 1917 during the height of World War I. It involved a grand scheme of potential sabotage that, if it had succeeded, could have meant disaster for the railroad, Canada, and the United States combined. It involved the president of the Marine City Salt Company, Albert Karl Kutschmidt. It was found out that he conspired with several others of German descent to blow up the St. Clair River Tunnel. According to the trial transcript, Karl Schmidt was the head of the German Secret Service branch for the state of Michigan. He was given the task of blowing up several important industrial targets in southeast Michigan and southwestern Ontario. The plan involved an amazingly simple scheme of using a large charge of dynamite strapped to a board, which in turn would be attached to a set of roller skates. The match would be lit at the top of the tunnel grade, and the extreme slope would quickly carry the bomb and its mechanism into the tunnel. Given up by a spy who was in his own ranks, Kutschmidt received 4 years in Leavenworth Penitentiary and a $20,000 fine. His sister also heavily involved. She was the one that was going to secure the roller skates, among other items. Received a 3-year term in the city of Detroit's jail. 2 other conspirators, Fritz Neef, who was married to Kutschmidt's sister, and Karl Schmidt of Detroit, received 2 years in Leavenworth and a $10,000 fine. Others who had been involved were already serving time for other bombings and attempted bombings and had their sentences extended. The second incident was also an attempt on the tunnel. It was early after the start of the Second World War in 1940. A train was seen exiting the tunnel with a boxcar on fire. After the train was stopped and the car was switched away and the fire put out, it was found that the car contained aircraft engines destined for delivery to Halifax, with eventual delivery to England. On further examination, it was found that arsonists had drilled holes in the bottom of the boxcar and inserted rags with flammable liquid. Due to the quick action of the Sarnia Fire Department, the flames were doused fairly quickly, and only the upper portion of the car and the crates engines were packed in were destroyed. Nothing was ever proven, but authorities who examined the rest of the train noted that a carload of explosives, which was coupled roughly 2 cars ahead of the one that caught fire, was the actual target of the attempt. In both cases, it's clear that the attempts to destroy the tunnel indicate how important a link it was considered in the transportation system between the United States and Canada. By early 1990s, Canadian National Railway had commissioned engineering studies for a replacement tunnel to be built adjacent to the existing St. Clair River Tunnel. In 1993, CN began construction on a newer and larger tunnel. CN President Paul Tellier declared at the ceremonies, "The tunnel will give CN the efficiency it needs to become a strong competitive force in North American transportation." Unlike when the first tunnel was hand-dug from both ends, an earth-boring machine called Excalibur, made by the Lubbock Tunnel Equipment Incorporated, was used. It started on the Canadian side and dug its way to the United States. The tunnel opened later in 1994, whereupon freight and passenger trains stopped using the adjacent original tunnel, whose bore was sealed. The new tunnel was dedicated on May 5, 1995. On November 30, 2004, CN announced that the new St. Clair River Tunnel would be named Paul M. Tellier Tunnel in honor of the company's retired president. I really don't like that name. To be honest with you, I don't think the St. Clair Tunnel is the best name. I kind of associate that with the city of St. Clair. I think it should have been named the Port Huron Sarnia International Railway Tunnel. But then again, they didn't ask me. But alas, a sign now hangs over each portal of this tunnel with this name. This is the Sarnia portal that we're looking at, and the Port Huron side will be just the opposite of this. But you can see the new tunnel on the right, and you can see the old tunnel on the left. And if you look closely, you can see those vent fans that we were looking at earlier. This is the Port Huron side, and you can see the old tunnel being on the right and the new tunnel being on the left on this side of the river. Looking at that second tunnel with that big piece of machinery called the Excalibur, seems almost like cheating. The first tunnel was built with much labor. I suppose that's progress. In researching these videos for this St. Clair Tunnel series, I've really come to appreciate the work that these men did and the difficulties that they certainly overcame. And today it's no big deal to see these newer engines and cars coming through the tunnel. But there was a time when it was a very big deal to see something like a train go underneath the St. Clair River and come out the other side. A sense of sadness fills me when I see the tunnel today in this photograph that's just a shadow of what it used to be. But there was a time when the St. Clair Tunnel put Port Huron and Sarnia on the map, and Port Huron was proud of the name that was put upon them, Tunnel City. In our next video, we'll continue looking at this area where the St. Clair Tunnel powerhouse was, and also which is known today as the Port Huron Seaway Terminal or the Bean Dock, and also a couple other things that were there you may not be aware of. So join me then.